Hey there, ready for a deep dive into something pretty profound.
Always.
Awesome. Today, we're going to be exploring the Church-Turing thesis.
Okay.
And this is a concept that kind of sits right at the intersection of computer science and philosophy,
Yeah.
which, especially for a philosopher like you listening, I think you'll find this really intriguing. We've got excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on this one.
Great. So buckle up.
It's really amazing how this thesis connects like the really detailed parts of computation with these huge philosophical questions about the limits of like what we can know.
Right.
It's like a bridge between calculating something and then like pondering the nature of truth itself.
I love that. Okay, so let's start with this idea of effective methods.
Okay.
Imagine a procedure, like a step-by-step process,
Yeah.
that anyone could follow to reach a solution without needing some sort of brilliant flash of insight.
Mm-hmm.
That's the basic idea, right?
Right.
The Stanford Encyclopedia points out, though, that just saying no insight or ingenuity isn't very precise.
Right.
Especially for a philosopher, the challenge is how to define this idea of a purely mechanical method rigorously.
Yeah, it makes me think of those philosophical thought experiments where you try to come up with a foolproof system for making ethical decisions.
Yeah,
Can you really create a set of rules that always leads to the right choice without needing any moral intuition?
that's a great analogy, and it really highlights the problem that both Alonzo Church and Alan Turing were wrestling with back in 1936. What's remarkable is that they each came up with formal, rigorous definitions of effective method, and those definitions turned out to be equivalent,
Wow.
even though they used completely different approaches.
So two brilliant minds tackle the same problem from different angles and end up at the same place.
Exactly.
That's got to be a good sign they were onto something big.
Yeah.
Tell me more about their approaches.
So Church dove deep into the world of mathematical logic. He was using a system called lambda calculus. But Turing, he took a different route, one that might be a bit easier to grasp, at least on the surface. He envisioned a theoretical machine, now known as the Turing machine.
The Turing machine. I've got to admit, even for someone who's not a computer scientist, that name definitely rings a bell.
It's a powerful concept. Imagine a chef following a recipe. They have ingredients, tools, and a set of instructions. A Turing machine is kind of like that.
Okay.
It works with symbols and rules, but instead of creating a delicious dish, it turns out computations.
So how does this theoretical machine connect to what a human can actually compute?
That's where it gets really interesting, especially from a philosophical perspective. Turing analyzed how we as humans perform calculations.
Hmm.
Whether we're using paper and pencil or just thinking things through in our heads, he argues that we're essentially manipulating symbols and following rules just like a Turing machine.
So is he saying that anything a human can calculate a Turing machine could do too?
Yeah,
That seems like a pretty radical claim.
that's the essence of the Church-Turing thesis. It's the idea that any problem solvable by an effective method, one we can do step by step, without any special insight, can also be solved by a Turing machine.
Wow. Okay, so if that's true, what does it mean for the limits of what computers can do?
If the Church-Turing thesis holds, it means there's a fundamental limit on what any computer, no matter how powerful, can achieve.
Mm-hmm.
It can't solve problems that are beyond the reach of a Turing machine.
So there might be problems out there that are simply uncomputable, even in principle.
Yeah,
That's a pretty profound implication, especially for someone who spends their time thinking about the nature of knowledge.
absolutely. And both Turing and Church were grappling with a famous problem that illustrates this point beautifully, the Entscheidungs problem.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What is the Entscheidungs problem?
It's German for decision problem, and it's all about finding a decision procedure for any logical statement. Imagine like a perfect algorithm, a set of instructions that could tell you with absolute certainty whether any given logical statement is true or false. That was the Entscheidungs problem, finding that ultimate logic solver,
That sounds incredibly powerful, like the holy grail of logic.
right? But the implications of the Church-Turing thesis suggested something quite shocking. Such a decision procedure for all of logic simply can't exist.
You're telling me there are truths out there that we can never definitively prove, even with the most powerful algorithm imaginable.
That's right.
That's mind-blowing,
And it raises profound questions about the nature of truth itself.
right?
Are there truths that are inherently inaccessible to any computational process, even in principle? That's where things get really interesting for a philosopher.
Absolutely. So this seemingly obscure problem in logic actually had huge implications for how we think about knowledge itself. What other philosophical rabbit holes does the Church-Turing thesis lead us down?
Oh, tons of them. It certainly does. The Church-Turing thesis touches on everything from the foundation of computer science to the potential limits of artificial intelligence, and even, as you pointed out, the very nature of the mind itself.
Yeah, it's almost like this idea isn't just about the limits of machines, it's about the limits of knowing. It makes me wonder if there are forms of knowledge, maybe even forms of consciousness, that are simply beyond the reach of computation as we currently understand it.
That's a question that's been haunting philosophers and computer scientists for decades. Could there be something more to the mind, something that can't be captured by a Turing machine? Turing's own analysis of human computation gets to the heart of this.
Right, he was trying to break down the act of thinking itself into steps a machine could, at least in theory, simulate. But could there be aspects of human thought that simply can't be captured that way?
Exactly. Turing focused on what's observable in human computation, the symbols we manipulate, the rules we follow. But what about things like intuition, insight, or the feeling of understanding? Can those be reduced to a set of mechanical rules?
Right, it's like asking if there's a secret ingredient in consciousness, something that goes beyond the recipe a Turing machine could follow.
It's a fascinating question, and it's important to remember that Turing wasn't working in a vacuum. Even before him, there were people fascinated by the idea of logic machines, devices that could mechanically solve logical problems.
So the idea of mechanizing reasoning had been brewing for a while.
Oh yeah, thinkers like William Stanley Jevons and Charles Sanders Peirce were actually building logic machines, trying to make reasoning as concrete and mechanical as possible. Peirce even anticipated the concept of a decision procedure, imagining a machine that could determine the truth or falsity of any logical statement. It's as if he was setting the stage for Turing's work without even realizing it.
That's fascinating. It's amazing how these intellectual threads weave together across time. But it still feels like there's this lingering question. Could there be something more, something that could surpass even the mighty Turing machine?
Well, that's the question that keeps this whole field alive. Let's delve into some of those challenges to the Church-Turing thesis. There are these fascinating thought experiments about accelerating Turing machines. What if we could make them work faster and faster, like with each step? Could they leapfrog over the limitations of standard Turing computation?
It's like pushing a Turing machine into computational overdrive. But wouldn't it still be bound by the same step-by-step logic, even at infinite speed?
That's the debate. Some argue that even with infinite acceleration, it wouldn't be able to compute anything fundamentally new. Others suggest that the very notion of infinite speed opens up possibilities beyond our current understanding.
Okay, so maybe speed isn't the answer. What about other approaches?
Well, there's the idea of relativistic computers, a mind-boggling concept where we'd harness the effects of Einstein's theory of relativity to perform computations. Imagine using space-time itself as a computational resource.
Whoa, that sounds like something straight out of science fiction. But I can see how a philosopher would be intrigued. We're talking about the very fabric of reality being used for computation.
And some theoretical models suggest that such relativistic computers could, in principle, solve problems that are uncomputable for a standard Turing machine. Of course, building such a device is way beyond our current capabilities.
So we've got speed, we've got relativity. Are there any other contenders in this challenge to the Church-Turing thesis?
One of the most profound challenges from a philosophical standpoint comes from considering the human mind itself. There's an argument that the mind is not static, that it's constantly developing and evolving in ways that might transcend the limitations of a Turing machine.
So it's not just about what we can compute now, but about the potential for the mind to evolve, to develop new computational capacities that we can't even fathom yet.
Exactly. And one of the most thought-provoking voices in this debate was Kurt Gödel, the legendary logician. He was skeptical that Turing's analysis of human computation captured the full richness of the mind. He argued that the mind is not bound by the same kind of strict finiteness that a Turing machine is.
So Gödel is essentially saying that there's something about the nature of consciousness, something about its potential for growth and development that Turing machines might be missing.
Precisely. And this raises the question, could there be future forms of computation that go beyond what Turing envisioned, forms that tap into this evolving nature of consciousness? It's a question that continues to fascinate and perplex those who grapple with the Church-Turing thesis.
It's a bit unsettling, isn't it, this idea that there might be entire realms of computational possibility, maybe even forms of thought and understanding that are simply beyond the reach of anything a Turing machine could do.
It certainly challenges our assumptions about the nature of computation and the limits of knowledge. But even within the framework of the Church-Turing thesis, there's still room for incredible richness and complexity.
I'm curious to explore that further. What are some of the ways people have tried to refine and expand on Turing's ideas, even while working within the framework of the Church-Turing thesis?
One of the most interesting attempts to grapple with these questions comes from Robin Gandy, a mathematician who was a student of Turing himself. Gandy developed his own analysis of computation, one that he saw as building on and extending Turing's work.
So Gandy was taking Turing's ideas even further, trying to refine and expand them. What was his approach?
Gandy focused on what he called discrete, deterministic, mechanical devices. These are systems that are built from a finite number of basic parts, operate in discrete steps, and whose behavior is fully determined by their current state and the rules governing their operation. Sound familiar?
It's like a more general version of a Turing machine, right? Something that captures the essential features of computation without being tied to a specific model, like the tape and head.
Precisely. And Gandhi argued that any such device, no matter how complex, can be simulated by a Turing machine. He even laid out a set of axioms, principles that he believed any such device must obey. It's like he was trying to create a more rigorous framework for thinking about the Church-Turing thesis, one that encompasses a wider range of possible computational systems.
But even with Gandhi's work, there are still these nagging doubts, these possibilities lurking at the edges of what we know. It's like the Church-Turing thesis, rather than being a final answer, is a starting point for a deeper exploration of the limits of computation and the nature of the mind.
Absolutely, and that exploration has taken some truly mind-bending turns. For instance, researchers have been delving into the world of quantum computing to see if it might offer something beyond Turing's model.
Ah, quantum computing, that's been making headlines lately. It's like a whole new level of computational power, exploiting the strange rules of the quantum world. Is there a chance that quantum computers could challenge the Church-Turing thesis?
It's a fascinating question. Some quantum algorithms seem to be able to solve problems that are, at least for practical purposes, impossible for classical computers. This has led some to wonder if quantum computers might break free from the constraints of the Church-Turing thesis.
But even if quantum computers are operating according to the laws of physics, aren't they ultimately performing computations that could, in principle, be carried out by a Turing machine, just maybe not in the realistic time frame?
That's where the debate gets really interesting. Some argue that even quantum computers are ultimately doing computations that a Turing machine could handle, albeit perhaps not within the lifespan of the universe. But others suggest that quantum mechanics might unlock computational possibilities that are fundamentally different, potentially surpassing Turing's model altogether. It's like peering into a realm where our very notion of computation takes on a whole new meaning.
Okay, so we've got quantum computing as a potential challenge. Are there any other contenders in this quest to go beyond the Turing machine?
There's also this intriguing, albeit somewhat radical, idea of hypercomputation systems that could compute functions beyond the reach of Turing machines. It might sound like something out of science fiction.
Hypercomputation, that definitely has a science fiction ring to it. But are there serious people exploring this idea?
Believe it or not, there are. Researchers are exploring theoretical models of hypercomputation, drawing on ideas from physics, mathematics, and even philosophy. One approach involves imagining systems that could perform an infinite number of operations in a finite amount of time.
Hold on, infinite operations in a finite amount of time. How is that even conceivable?
It's a theoretical possibility based on the idea of accelerating processes or tapping into certain mathematical structures. Whether or not such systems could exist in the real world is another matter entirely. It pushes the boundaries of what we even mean by computation.
So we've got quantum computing, hypercomputation. It seems like the Church-Turing thesis, far from being a settled matter, is actually a springboard for all sorts of new ideas and challenges.
That's the beauty of it. It's a thesis that continues to spark debate, push the boundaries of our understanding, and challenge us to think deeply about the nature of computation, the limits of knowledge, and the potential of the human mind.
Okay, so we've kind of journeyed through this landscape of Turing machines and uncomputable problems and even the mind-bending possibilities of quantum and hypercomputation. But for a philosopher like you, the listener, I think the most intriguing part is what all of this means for our understanding of knowledge, truth, and the nature of the mind itself.
Absolutely. The Church-Turing thesis throws open some fundamental philosophical doors. For instance, if the thesis is true, it implies that there's like a hard limit on what can be known or calculated, even in principle.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty radical idea, especially for someone who, spends their life exploring the vastness of philosophical questions.
It's almost like there's this invisible barrier out there, beyond which lies the realm of the uncomputable.
Right.
And that raises so many questions.
Exactly.
Like, for example, if there are mathematical truths that are uncomputable, does that mean they're somehow less true than those that can be proven by a Turing machine?
Yeah.
It makes you wonder about the hierarchy of truth itself.
It certainly challenges our intuitions about what it means for something to be knowable, and it also has profound implications for the debate about artificial intelligence. If the human mind is truly more than just a computational system, does that mean we'll never be able to create machines that are truly intelligent, maybe even conscious?
It's a question that's been at the heart of so much science fiction and philosophical debate. Are we just complex biological machines? Or is there something fundamentally different about human consciousness?
And the Church-Turing thesis adds another layer to that debate. If there are forms of knowledge or forms of thought that are inherently uncomputable, what does that tell us about the nature of the human mind?
It makes you wonder if those aspects of consciousness that seem most mysterious and elusive, things like intuition, creativity, or the feeling of understanding, might somehow be connected to this realm of the uncomputable. Could it be that those are the very things that set us apart from any machine, no matter how sophisticated?
It's a tantalizing possibility, one that pushes us to reconsider our assumptions about both the power and the limitations of computation. But there's another philosophical puzzle lurking here, one that might keep our listener up at night. Can the Church-Turing thesis even be definitively proven or disproven? It seems to occupy this strange middle ground between a mathematical theorem and a philosophical principle.
That's a great point. It's not like we can just crank through some equations and declare it definitively true or false. It feels like it hinges on these deeper philosophical assumptions about the nature of computation and knowledge.
You've hit the nail on the head. Turing himself argued that any proof of the Church-Turing thesis would ultimately have to rely on our intuitions about what we mean by effective method or computation.
Right.
It's not like proving a theorem in geometry where you start with axioms and derive consequences. It's more about building a convincing case.
So it's not just about mathematical rigor, it's about philosophical persuasion. And the case for the Church-Turing thesis rests on this fascinating blend of empirical evidence, theoretical arguments, and philosophical intuition.
Precisely. And I think that's what makes it so compelling, especially for a philosopher. It's a thesis that invites us to reflect deeply on the nature of computation, the limits of our knowledge, and the very essence of what it means to be human.
Absolutely. So to our philosopher listener, we'll leave you with this final thought. The Church-Turing thesis, more than just a technical idea, is a philosophical provocation, a springboard for exploring some of the deepest questions about the nature of reality, knowledge, and the mind. It's a journey that might not have a final destination, but it's a journey worth taking.